Bonjour. Good day, everybody. Je vais vous prévenir, ce panel va se tenir en anglais puisque notre panel d'experts va s'exprimer en anglais. So, hello, everybody. This is a very important panel to start the day. Downtown's economic recovery for a sustainable and resilient city. As we all know, the pandemic has hit everybody, but at different levels. And downtown cities have been hit very hard, and especially downtowns. So if we talk about Montreal, for example, where I am and where the organization is, well, our downtown is completely deserted because of the model of the way it was developed. It is less than 4% of the residents of Montreal that live in Montreal, but 27% of the workforce work downtown. So it's been deserted by workers. It's been deserted by universities because most of our universities and colleges in Montreal are downtown. And of course, the tourists, which is very, very area that is very loved by international tourism, is also deserted. So how can we make it that it comes back? There's been a lot of thought given to that. Committees have been set up. And there's been efforts and reflection first by the City of Montreal, who right away in May put up a committee to say, how can we revive our downtown? And especially because our downtown in Montreal is very, very high concentration of cultural places. And I am the chair of the board of Partenariat des Quartiers de Spectacle, who have 80 venues for cultural activities. Of course, everything has been closed since March of 2020. So the City of Montreal has done efforts, has presented a plan 2 weeks ago. The government of Quebec has announced also a program to help downtowns, and we're waiting for the federal government. But now, this morning, we have experts, a very good panel. Unfortunately, one had to miss out at the last minute, but we'll make most of the three we have and have longer time to make their presentation. First of all, Anya Sirota. She is a professor, associate professor at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Bonjour, Anya.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. And then we'll go on with Aziza Akhmouch. Now, Aziza Akhmouch is head of division of city and urban planning. She has a very long title, urban planning policies and sustainable development at the OECD. So she will give us maybe a more international perspective of things. And then we come back to Montreal, but for not the least, Richard Shearmur, who is professor and director of the School of Urban Studies at the University of McGill, who's downtown, by the way, Montreal. So what we suggest is that, first of all, we will start with Anya, then each of you will make a presentation, and then we will have an exchange between the panelists, and of course, we will have questions coming from the public, which will be they will be given to us by our technicians. So, with no further ado, Anya.
OK. Merci, Monique. C'est vraiment un plaisir de vous rejoindre.
Anya?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me? Great.
Okay. Go.
It's a pleasure to join this conversation. It's a topic that's very close to my heart, both as a researcher and a practitioner based in Detroit, Michigan. I'm currently, as principal of Akhmouch, working in collaboration with the French landscape architecture firm Agence Terre on leading the Cultural Center Planning Initiative in Midtown Detroit. And it's an effort that attempts to unify 12 unique cultural institutions into a collective landscape in the heart of the city. And so this is a great challenge at a time when resources are scarce and there are so many pressing needs in the city, and a commitment to invigorating, recovering the space of public encounter is so necessary, but so difficult to chart forward. So in the Detroit context, like in many cities across the United States, we've seen as you mentioned, Monique, the great difficulty of energizing our cities, because of the flux and change in the way that the workforce moves and inhabits the office space. So we know that approximately 40% of U.S. office workers, largely highly educated class of people, have been able to shelter in place with relative, let's say, comfort, if quite a bit of mental anguish associated with it. But it has produced a daily experience that has significantly changed the way that workers imagine the flexibility of their experience. We estimate in many ways that post-pandemic, some portion of the week will involve work from home. MIT reports have stated that as many as 1 to 3 days will still be happening at home. And so as this hybrid model emerges, where we balance the kinds of efficiencies that we've gained from this at-home experience with the benefits of social interaction and creativity and innovation, when we all come together in person again, we have to think about what that proportion of time to space will inflect on our cities and our city centers. Of course, 60% of workers cannot work from home. And this is where a lot of our energy needs to be focused as we think both in the short term and the long term. The decline of daily commuters and business travel has had a domino effect on workers that support service industry and office spaces. So 1 in 4 workers in the United States works in transportation, food service, cleaning, maintenance, retail, personal care. And those jobs are concentrated in city centers. These are lower paid jobs. And this is where a significant inflection and investment of capital into building a social safety net is absolutely necessary for us to be able to move forward and imagine a possible future for city centers. So in the short term, what we found that's critical is retaining empathy for our city centers, even while we know that the typical occupation and typical programming are not possible. This means investing in arts and culture. We've seen the reappropriation of spaces, for example, parking garages, to create cultural experiences that are unlike any we've experienced before in Detroit. For example, the theater director, Yuval Sharon, he created Twilight Gods, which transformed a parking structure into a drive-through opera. And of course, this isn't a solution that's an economic one, it's an empathetic one. It's a way to remember that the space of the city is still the space that will need to be transformed once this pandemic is over. There's also the possibility of working with digital scenographies in the short term. In other words, when we create these disembodied experiences, where are they housed? How do we design those experiences? And how do we continuously revert and remember that the space of our city is the theatrical backdrop of our daily life? So how do we begin to create those experiences? And we've tested ways to create empathetic sentiments toward our downtown through engagement activities that digitize our real space in order to remember how important it is when we come back together. Ephemeral interventions, of course, are prototypes for new realities in the city, and contingent on who is funding them and how they are born into reality makes a big difference. So we're seeing the gig economy, for example, inflect city centers where parking lots are transformed into ghost kitchens for new models of restaurant businesses. There are also micro social safety nets that are beginning to emerge, where literal community organizations are partnering with restaurants in order to create food resources for neighborhoods that have food insecurities, and shifting goods and services around the city in order to ensure that those downtown who currently don't have clientele are engaging directly with those in the perimeter of the city that have needs. Of course, we've also seen the inflection of the stimulus package in the United States, which has in some ways provided a universal basic income for those in need. Now, it hasn't been universal in any way, but at least a portion or a test of how universal basic income might work in these scenarios. And what we've seen in Michigan is that assistance, that capital assistance, has instigated 4,000 new businesses opening each week in Michigan. Of course, we don't know whether those are sustainable businesses, but it shows an appetite for self-management and opportunity. And we can imagine how that can become a program that also invests and inflects the possibilities of city reappropriation. And I know that my colleagues here will talk about long-term implications, but ultimately these short-term tests or prototypes for how cities could be reimagined will invariably inflect long-term thinking. So it's asking us to abandon, in many ways, what we're seeing in the north, in the north of the United States context, abandon the live-work binaries that have dictated the development of modern cities, and create and reimagine the downtown as simply a receptacle for capital. And it's asking us to think of new typologies that enrich the possibility of a more equitable, diverse, and resilient condition in the urban realm. And it's showing us that we must, regardless of how complex and difficult our economic scenario is currently, we must continue to invest in arts and culture, because office spaces might no longer move people, but cultural experiences, collective cultural experiences, will always shift perception and activate collective experience.
It's music to my ears, what you've just last said, of course. And I think some of the experiences we've just described in Detroit, we have tried also in Montreal, and I've seen many phenomena also of new partnerships of people working together, which would have been competitors are not competitors anymore. You know, you're in a bad situation, you have to help out each other. And a lot of innovation also. Of course, the stimulus packages in Canada were more generous, I would say, in many ways than the American ones. And that helped a lot, but still, it's very difficult. So then we'll go on to Aziza. So Aziza, from the OECD, and from your perspective, what can we do for our downtowns, which are in bad shape?
Thank you very much, Monique. And that's indeed a very timely, topical, and relevant conversation we're having today, because from the mapping and analysis of policy responses in 100 cities from the 37 OECD countries, we have seen that this conversation about downtown revival, support to business and SMEs recovery, revamping of the local economic system, but also the connection of the urban core centers to their surroundings and rural areas has become really the hot potato for many decision makers. And probably because indeed, as you rightly said, cities were particularly slammed by this crisis because of their density, of course, but most importantly, because of the precarious living conditions of the different people in different types of settlement that have somehow sometimes turned what we usually call the agglomeration benefits and premium into a penalty somehow, but also because in terms of the tourism sector, the cultural gap and shock, the lack of engagement of the creative sector, the SMEs, we estimate that 1 in 2 is going to collapse over the coming year in urban centers. And this awkward distinction that was made in different countries between essential services that were given some exemption somehow in these difficult times and non-essential services where often you put the cultural component, have really generated social bombs that I think in the very short term can hinder not only the productivity of those metropolitan areas, but also the well-being of their residents at large. And we know that the bigger the cities, the bigger the inequalities, and therefore large cities, of course, with varying degrees based on their local labor markets composition, exposure to global value chains, reliance on industry versus services, tradable versus non-tradable sectors, were exposed differently to the crisis and will have different capacities to rebound. But we've also seen a conversation emerge in many OECD countries about the potential of mid-sized cities to rebalance a bit this quality of life, and therefore this idea that the revival of downtown should not be only on large metropolitan areas, and it's needed there, but also in these mid-sized cities. And you have in France, for example, programs like Action Cœur de Ville that gained a lot of traction in this recovery period to basically support the Build Back Better movement. So I think for me, there are two big highlights that came out of the conversation we've been having with OECD countries, one on the short term and one on the long term. On the short term, what we've seen most of the governments do is actually to do the basics of containing the pandemic, but also the economic shock and more than 5% drop in GDP in only OECD countries. So, of course, that meant enforcing social distancing and lockdown. That meant ensuring the continuity of local public services, including transports, but also public gardens, parks, targeting vulnerable groups at the very local level, because this is the proximity scale that allows decision makers to do so. Supporting business recoveries. We've seen all over the place, exemptions that were provided to use the terraces for some of the restaurants in between two lockdowns, and other, more ad hoc measures that gave a bit of oxygen to that economic system, and also, generating that trust and awareness at the very local level to do some of the damage control, especially for this geography of discontent. This was very much a first phase. Let's say the first 3 months, most of the cities were stuck with these initiatives, in addition to implementing nationwide measures. And now what we've seen for the last 3 months as part of the recovery packages design is a much longer term perspective, which in all places is basically trying to address the crisis and build back better in the recovery through the inclusion lens, the green lens, and the smart lens. How we put the technology at the service of well-being, how we seize this momentum that makes today a lot of the environmental policies way more acceptable socially and politically than they were just a year ago, and the cycling path conversation, but way beyond that. And how equally important we fight inequality, because this crisis has also deepened the inequality, including between the urban centers and the periphery. And for me, and I'll conclude with that, the combination of the Zoom effect, which we have all tested, and where we have all learned that teleworking is not necessarily a synonymous of productivity loss, and the Greta effect that was already gaining traction prior to this crisis, but I think has now shown the emergency of dealing with the environmental issues, because we know these pandemics are connected to habitat loss and environmental degradation, is raising big opportunities for cities, in particular in 3 areas. The first one is how we rethink the shift from a logics of mobility. We take people from point A to point B and transport, and into a logics of accessibility. And that's all the conversations we see emerging around the 10-minute city, the 15-minute city, the 20-minute city. This idea that people don't agglomerate in metropolitan areas just for work and productivity, also to access all these services. And I subscribe to what was said before, including leisure, culture. And this experiment shows that you could do marginally a bit of online education, telemedicine, teleworking where possible, but this will definitely not be a substitute for what generates the spatial concentration benefits and what provides the rationale for people agglomerating in cities. But this shift is quite interesting. There's a second one, which for me is really important, related to the teleworking, which holds big implications. What are we going to do with all these offices where indeed people are not going to work anymore, any longer, or at least every day? And there I would put a caveat, not only because not everybody can telework, and I subscribe to what we said earlier. Only in France, we have 20 percentage points between different regions, Paris and other regions, in terms of the telework ability. But also because I believe in many cases, our labor legislation is not equipped for that change to become structural, the way we measure productivity, the way we conceive the hierarchy, and I could go on with the list. I think sometimes we're at odds with the trust that teleworking requires and the social interaction that also makes people productive, which is not just doing Zooms and Skypes. But I think most importantly, sometimes we still have digital infrastructure issues, and we've seen places in Italy where 40% of the households in some of the southern provinces were not equipped with laptops. You can have 4G, 5G. If you don't have the basics that target inequality, you're not supporting, that inclusive recovery. And the third and last point for me is our relationship to time. I think the future of cities will rely on our capacity individually and collectively to understand that we no longer need to do the same thing at the same time in the same place. And I think the future of infrastructure, what is a school during the day that can become something else in the evening, and there were very interesting examples provided by Anya before, is really the way to go to minimize the pressure on public services and or natural resources. We don't need to be in traffic jam and in overcrowded subways to get to the office at 9 a.m. anymore. I hope this experience was enlightening in that respect, and how we can desynchronize our social lives and have different relationships to those traditional peaks is probably, from a sustainability perspective, the way to build back better, also in terms of the economic recovery.
Thank you very much. Desynchronize our lives. Okay, that's very, very interesting. Just wanted to up to date for people that are listening to us. As of last afternoon, yesterday, our Prime Minister, at least in Quebec, announced that we will be in almost total lockdown from December 25 to January 11th, and only essential businesses will be open, which is what grocery stores and drugstores, etc. Schools are closed till January 11th. So, and it's no partying. It's now the third. We had the first in the spring, where people kind of adjusted. We learned a lot. In the summer, we had a break. And then a lot of interesting initiatives, and the way Anya talked about it, sprung from the cultural world, even from the business part. But I don't think we got so many new businesses, though. And people were trying to adapt. And then 1st of October, we went back to a semi kind of lockdown. But because of the numbers, we're going up again. And then now it's and they're taking so this, of course, when you're working on the issue of downtown, which I am, so we're trying to work very hard. We had a forum organized by last week by La Chambre de Commerce, and which a wonderful forum about downtown, and had a plan of action of 80 pages and measures on all aspects that you can imagine. But it's difficult, to take your breath and let's go and work on it, because we never know what's going to happen. Vaccination has started on Monday in Canada. So how many months will it take? We don't know. But what I find very interesting in your presentation is how you say we have to rethink a lot of things in the city, and especially in our downtowns, because we've noticed here, like elsewhere, that local neighborhoods have been much less affected. Local businesses, proximity businesses, have been less affected than the ones downtown, or literally there's no customers anymore. So I know that Richard Shermer has been giving a lot of thought. That's what he's studying right now. So it's your turn, Richard. À toi la parole.
Thank you very much. Bonjour. I think one of the things that we need to realize is right now we're in the middle of a shock, and there are sort of emergency measures that need to be taken, and we look around us and downtowns look totally decimated. But I think in the longer term, I suspect the changes will actually be rather smaller than we expect. And one of the reasons I say that is that we don't quite capture what changes were already happening before COVID occurred. I focus a lot on where people work. That's really what I do my research on, and on the economy of downtowns. But and so when COVID struck, I had already a lot of information on the changes in how people were working, on flexible office space, on the amount of time people already worked at home. There is this idea that suddenly people have worked at home. That is absolutely not the case. People who work in offices, on average, they already worked about a day a week at home. All right. So this is before the pandemic. So now we are suddenly realizing that this is happening, but it was happening before the pandemic. Likewise, retail. Yes, retail has taken a terrible hit in downtowns, but retail was already struggling. There's the online retail was emerging. Certainly in North America, the suburban retail offer was becoming more of an experience-based retail. There was a lot more cultural activities happening outside of downtown. And so people were no longer attracted so much to downtown for their cultural experiences before the pandemic. Which means that when we then look at the pandemic, or certainly my view of the pandemic, is that a lot of these trends have been accelerated. And of course, they have gone well beyond what would have been expected had there been no pandemic. But I think when we then think about the after pandemic, the changes that we're going to notice in the long term are, I think, going to be the extrapolation and maybe a slight acceleration of trends that we already saw before. So yes, more people will be working from home. That was already happening. There will be a few more. It will become more acceptable. Downtown retail, which was already struggling, is going to, it's going to have to become more experience-based. It's going to have to try and attract people and combine the online and the offline experience. And the reality of the neighborhoods and suburbs taking more place in terms of the offer of restaurants, in terms of the offer of culture, is also something which downtown was already having to cope with before, and which COVID has revealed. So just like COVID has revealed the inequality, which hasn't been created, it may have been accelerated by COVID, but it was a problem well before COVID. The need for more environmentally sound infrastructures and mobility solutions was already well developed before COVID and is now being accelerated. I also think the changes we're going to see in terms of the economy and where people work will be maybe an acceleration of what we were seeing before, but nothing absolutely new. And I base this not only on my observations of this pandemic, but if you read about previous disasters, whether they're wars, whether they're previous pandemics, there was never a revolution. There was an acceleration of trends that were already latent before. And I think this is the big message that I wanted to sort of convey, is that we didn't necessarily have a very good understanding of the way downtowns were changing before the pandemic, particularly from an economic perspective. I've done a lot of research on that over the last 20 years, and there has been a big change over the last 10 years, which hasn't yet been fully reflected in our studies. And I think that is what we're going to see in the longer term. It's already been mentioned, but I think it's worth talking about the fact that once all this is over, I do think that most of the office space is going to be used again. So the people will be working maybe an extra half day or an extra day at home. But there are many advantages to working in an office. So people are going to come back to downtown, but there will be some very important marginal changes. Even if people come back to downtown and say there are maybe at any one time 10 or 20% fewer people downtown, that's fewer offices. It's not the end of offices, but it's a marginal offices, which are going to have to be thinking, what are we going to do with this extra 10 or 20% of marginal offices? The same with retail. These stores which were struggling and which are reinventing themselves online or in the suburbs, there will be vacant spaces. How are we going to use them to revive downtown? And this is where maybe some of the activities which have been pushed out of downtown, the smaller companies, the creative occupations, which have been moving out to the suburbs, may actually find cheaper space, may find alternative usage for these spaces. And here, I think that many of the ideas and solutions which were put forward by Mrs. Sirota may actually help on the real estate side to revive downtown, but this will be at the margins. I still think that downtowns will be recognizable after the pandemic is over.
Well, you're very optimistic, but I still sense that between Aziza's presentation and your observation or conclusion, Professor Shermer, there's not necessarily a total agreement. And again, to come back to Anya's presentation about Detroit, we know that Detroit, way before, 20 or 25 years ago, there were great documentaries made about Detroit, how Detroit really crashed, was on the verge of bankruptcy before there was the revival. A lot of things were invented there, but they had to crash completely to reborn again. Do you expect that, Professor Shearmur, that Montreal will go down to revive? Or
no.
Even...
What happened in the many U.S. cities, and Detroit in particular, was a very particular social issue, and it's been written about in terms of white flight. So there was a structural changes when manufacturing was decimated, and there was very strong social pressures which weakened downtown in Detroit. So it wasn't and in a number of other North American cities, we didn't see that same decimation in Canada at the time. So I think that these are two rather different things. There's a long-term structural and social changes in North American cities led to the weakness of their downtowns. Here we're dealing with a one-off shock. And I think it's better to look at what happened. There's a very great research that's been done on Nagasaki after the atom bomb was dropped on it in 1945. And after 15 or 20 years, it had totally recovered. It was back on trend. And even a major destruction of that sort, basically the city came back. And we're looking at nothing like that. I think we shouldn't exaggerate what's happening during the pandemic either. We're in the middle of it. All we see are the problems. I think if we take a longer term view, we can see that there will be changes, but there will be more at the margin, and it's not such a fundamental.
Okay. So anyhow, essentially you're saying these things were happening before. People were shopping more online than going to the boutiques. People were already working at home a day, a week, or not. So these were trends. It was accelerated, but the adaptation, the rhythm of adaptation must be accelerated in a way.
Absolutely.
Probably. Because you say 20% of the space, of office space, will be empty. How long can you have a city with 20% of its space downtown unoccupied?
My rough estimate is probably about 10 to 20%. But if you look at economic downturns like the early 80s or even the early 90s, vacancy rates of 15 or 20% are unfortunately do happen in cities, and they eventually get resolved by the real estate market maybe not producing as much. As the economy slowly grows, these spaces get occupied. So vacancies of 10, 15, 20% are unfortunate, but they're not unheard of in real estate markets either. Now, it will take time, but I think that my time horizon is 5 or 10 years. I'm not looking at the next 2 or 3 years where, yes, there is going to be problems. When we recover from any major recession or any major shock, it takes time. Remember, my time horizon is 5 to 10 years. It's not looking at the next few months.
And in between, I'm asking the question to the three of you. Public programs support is needed to go through that period. Right now, we're in total COVID crisis. We're still starting to vaccinate people. We still have a year probably to go before getting out of the health issue. And are public programs needed to go through that transition period of which you've just talked about, of 2, 3, 4 years? Aziza?
Yeah, sure. I think what we've seen for the past 9 months is the absolute, let's say, commitment of governments to foot the bill. In French, the president even used the expression "quoi qu'il en coûte," and to help contain some of the risks and downsides of the pandemic, not only in terms of the sanitary consequences, of course, and to have a very cautious and so on approach, but also in terms of the economic dimension and the social dimension. And we've seen, the millions and billions that were poured, from debt guarantees all the way way through loans and grants and direct support to SMEs, cash transfers to targeted groups. So I think there is no doubt for at least many OECD countries that this was the trend and that this will last and continue for a few months. I think what was said before about COVID-19 being more a trend accelerator than revealing new types of structural challenges is absolutely spot on. Actually, in the City Policy Responses report that we published, lesson number 1 is there is nothing new. This is a magnifying glass on long-standing problems that our cities, our economies have had for a decade. What is new for me is 2 things. The first one is the combination of different problems that probably creates the momentum that makes a number of measures way more acceptable socially and politically today than they were just a year ago. I mean, many of you may know the example of Paris just 2 years ago, where the mayor was closing the riverfront of the Seine River to set a cycling path that would be friendly for walking and cycling. And the major resistance that she had to face at the time, from car drivers and other types of constituencies, is something we've not seen in the dozens and dozens of cities that have developed this corona piste from one day to another. So what has changed? The combination of inequality and the understanding that those that were hit particularly hard were not hit just in terms of their money and revenues, but all the multi-dimensional aspect of well-being. That's the first point. And the second point, very briefly, for me, if you look at all the pandemics in the past, they have all triggered rethinking about cities. But the main difference this time is digital. If you take the cholera and Paris in the 19th century, before Paris was transformed into a postal card, we engage huge infrastructure and sanitary work and so on. The main difference here is the digital part. It's this idea that we can, to some extent, substitute the physical proximity by the digital proximity, and therefore shake somehow the assumption that the urban premium, relies on the spatial concentration of workers and firms and people in large settlements. That's absolutely the conversation around people leaving large metro areas to settle down in rural areas because now they can telework. And I think this is the assumption that needs to be contained, because there's clearly a reality check to that. And I agree there are things happening in a year, 2, 3, and there are more structural trends, including in terms of the downside of digital proximity, that I think will not completely reverse the trends that we've seen so far and that build our downtown energy as well.
Okay. Yes, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that there is this new digital dimension. And I think one of the problems that we have is actually understanding what the longer term future will be so that public policies can sort of guide us towards that. Now, part of that is political will. There's a certain amount of politics we can choose where we go, but only a certain amount. Quite a lot is actually going to be determined by the previous trends. And that's the difficulty. What do these public policies actually aim for realistically? And I think that the need for physical proximity will change, but a lot of the previous research has shown that digital proximity is often a complement to face-to-face proximity and very rarely a substitute. And I think that we need to bear these things in mind. But basically, I think that one of the big unknowns, but which Mrs. Akhmouch has was talking about, is the political will. Politically, where the cities want to be, and will this change that desire? And I'm not convinced it will. I hope so.
Okay, Anya, any thoughts on that? Anya?
I was just going to add that, a very vernacular metaphor for the frog that, can get slow cooked if you just add 1 degree of temperature to the bowl, to the cooking pot, versus throwing the frog into a very hot pot. So I couldn't agree more with Professor Shearmur's notion that we're seeing an acceleration of latent trends. But at the same time, we're seeing a unique opportunity where the political sensibility of both power and people can come together in a unique moment to shift perception about possible urban futures. And I think if we don't take advantage of that in this unique moment, of course, chances are we'll go back to some sort of status quo where cultural production is an interim use or a Band-Aid for an economic recovery that's long-term, but the actual morphology of our city doesn't change significantly. I just hope that we take advantage of this particular moment.
Well, I think that if we come back to Montreal, I think right now the administration in Montreal has the program was very much oriented where a more environmentally conscious city. Also, the accessibility, the whole rethinking of accessibility. And what they've decided is to accelerate, since the beginning of the pandemic, accelerate a certain number of changes that would have taken a longer time before. Of course, this creates a lot of uproar. It's not done completely well. There's a communication problem. But I tend to agree that it's an accelerator to change. And also to rethinking. You can't think like you used to think, because what happened, nobody thought it would ever happen, except in wars or in total destruction, that, a virus could stop everything. Now, questions are, of course, that some sectors are very, very more vulnerable than others. And they're downtown, like culture, like the theaters, cinema, this is everything. So, of course, these are sectors that need their more active support to go through that period, because they're completely inactive. There's been a digital use or trying to film them and broadcast and put them on the web, but we know that that's just temporary. And also tourists, how will you attract tourists? Because transport, a lot of downtowns, I would have liked that our friend from Milan be with us, because Italy lives a lot out of tourism, and a city like Milan. So what's the answer to that? And when tourists, they go to downtowns, they don't go to suburbs. So how this challenge, and of course, the amount of workforce that work in the proportion of the workforce that are in services, restaurants. Right now, all the restaurants, one after the other one, are announcing that they're definitely closing, because, they just can't do it. Even though they had help, they had subsidies for their manpower, subsidies for their rents, tax freeze, it's still not enough for them. So on a very, very, should there be more people that live in downtowns that are built on the model of Montreal, where you have only 4% of the population that live? Is that the solution to bring more people? I'm asking that to Professor Shearmur. Is that a solution to compensate the 20% in occupation of?
Well, I think that partly some of these buildings could be maybe transformed to accommodation, but it's not a solution for downtown. Why? Because downtown functions because it attracts people. That's what makes downtown downtown. If nobody is attracted to downtown from the outside, it's just another residential neighborhood. So if we want our downtown to become just another high-density residential neighborhood, yes, that's that's fine. But if downtown is going to be something else, to project an identity, to project something about the city, to be a place of mingling, then it has to, almost by definition, attract workers, attract tourists, attract people at weekends. And that centrality, that's a technical word for it, that centrality of downtowns, certainly in North America, has been diminishing over the last few years before the pandemic. And I think as a geographer, that's my concern, is that these downtowns are slowly losing their centrality over time. And that does make big metropolitan areas lose their identity. We don't have an identity if everything is happening in neighborhoods and everything is happening in suburban centers.
Is it in a way, like you're saying, there was a trend already that what we're looking at is an acceleration of trends, and that the downtowns were already changing, that what we defined as downtowns, the attractions of downtowns, because of the creation of other venues elsewhere, will be less important in the years to come than it was in the past years.
Well, I'll just briefly answer. I think that actually downtowns need to try and reinvent themselves, to actually look at what's happening in the suburb and say, we can do better, and try and rebuild their centrality.
Okay, well, that's good. That's a challenge. Okay, our time is up. So I thank you very, very much for your very insightful analysis. Aziza Akhmouch, Richard Shearmur, and Anya Sirota. And I hope that we will get out of this period as soon as possible, that we will find the means and support our local governments and our governments and giving back to our downtowns the energy they need and the means they need to come back to life. Merci beaucoup.